Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. After the Crime, by Constant Guéraud. Part 1. It was at the extremity of a village. A window was hurriedly thrown open and a man appeared at it, his features livid, his eyes haggard, his lips agitated by a convulsive tremor. His right hand grasped a knife from which blood was dripping, drop by drop. He cast a look into the silent country, then sprang to the ground and set off running away through the fields. At the end of a quarter of an hour he stopped, exhausted, breathless, at the edge of a wood 20 paces from a highway. He searched for the most closely grown, the most impenetrable spot to be found, and pressed his way into it, regardless of the thorns that were tearing him. Then he began to dig up the earth with his knife. When he had made a hole a foot deep, he placed the weapon in it and covered it with the soil he had dug out, recovered it with a grass sod which he had trampled down solidly, after which he sat down upon the wet grass. He listened and appeared terrified by the silence which hung upon the country. It was the hour when the darkness of night is replaced by that gray and uniform tint which is neither day nor night, and through which objects look like phantoms. It seemed to him that he was alone in this funereal immensity, in the midst of this dumb and dim nature. Suddenly, a sound made him start. It was the axle of a wagon creaking on the road, a league away perhaps, but in the silence this strange and discordant noise made itself heard with singular distinctness. Then nature awoke little by little. The lark took flight towards the blue sky, pouring out his notes at once timid and charming, overflowing with life and happiness. A winged tribe began to sing and flutter amid the leaves glittering with dew. On all sides, in the moss on which the golden insect was crawling, to the branch of the highest oak where the bird voluptuously plumed herself in the ether, arose a morning concert so harmonious in its confusion, so potent in its delirium, so full of greeting to the first rays coming from the east that it might well be called a hymn to the sun. Nature expanded herself radiant and virginal. All was grace, freshness, sparkle in the forest where a blue mist still floated. All was calm and hushed in the plain, the great lines of which undulated to infinity, the gray tones of which grew light under the reflection of the blue sky. The murderer rose. His limbs trembled and his teeth clattered one against the other. He cast furtive glances around him, then parted the branches with precaution, stopping, starting, drawing back his head hastily at the least sound. Then at length he quitted the densely grown thicket in which he had buried his knife. He pressed forward deeper into the forest, choosing always the most shaded portions and avoiding the open parts and the beaten paths, making frequent stoppages to listen or to examine the ground before him ere he advanced. In this way he walked all day without being conscious of fatigue, so great was the agony which dominated him. He paused at the entrance to a grove of beeches, whose imposing trunks stood white and smooth like thousands of columns crowned with foliage. A calm day, a harmonious silence added to the impression of grandeur and retirement made by this beautiful spot. Something animate seemed to throb amid the luminous shade of the motionless boughs, as if a soul were there amid the shadows, murmuring mysterious syllables. The fugitive felt ill at ease, and creeping like a reptile forced his way under a clump of thorn bushes, the density of which completely hid him. When he was in safety, he first raised his hand to his head, and then to his stomach, and muttered, "I am hungry." The sound of his voice made him shudder. It was the first time he had heard it since the murder, and it resounded in his ears like a knell and a menace. For some moments he remained motionless and held his breath, as if in fear of having been heard. When he had become a little calmer, he felt in his pockets one after the other. They contained a few sous. "That will be enough," he said in a low tone. "In 6 hours I shall have crossed the frontier. Then I can show myself." I can work, and shall be saved. At the end of an hour he felt the cold begin to stiffen his limbs, for with the coming of night the dew fell, and his only clothes were a linen blouse and trousers of the same material. He rose, and cautiously quitting his thorn bushes, continued his march. He halted at the first signs of dawn. He had reached the limits of the forest and must now enter upon the open country, must show himself in the full light of day. And struck with terror by this thought, he dared not advance a step further. While he was standing hidden in a thicket, the sound of horses' hoofs was heard. He turned pale. "Gendarmes," he gasped, crouching down upon the ground. It was a farm laborer going to the fields with 2 horses harnessed to a wagon. He was whistling a country air while retying the lash of his whip. "Jacques," a voice cried to him. The peasant turned round. "Hello, is that you, Francois? Where are you going so early?" "Oh, I'm going to wash this bundle of linen at the spring close by." "I'm going within 2 steps of it. Put your bundle on one of my beasts." "Thanks, that's not to be refused. How's the wife and the little ones, all of them?" "I'm the weakest of the family," replied Jacques, laughing loudly. "All goes well, work, joy, and health." He tied his lash, and the sharp crack was repeated by echo after echo. The murderer followed him with his eyes as far as he could see him. Then a deep sigh escaped from his lips, and his gaze turned to the open country spreading before him. "I must get on," he murmured. "It is 24 hours since all is discovered. I am being sought. An hour's delay may ruin me." He made up his mind resolutely and quitted the forest. At the end of 10 minutes he came within sight of a church tower. Then he slackened his pace, a prey to 1,000 conflicting feelings, drawn towards the village by hunger, restrained by the fear which counseled him to avoid habitations. However, after a long struggle, during which he had advanced as much as possible under the screen of outhouses and bushes, he was about to enter the village, when he saw something glitter about 100 paces from him. It was the brass badge in the pommel of a rural policeman's saber. "He may have my description," he murmured with a shudder. And shrinking back quickly, he ran to a little wood which extended on his left and hid himself in it, pushing further and further into its depths, forgetting his hunger and thinking only of flying from the village and the rural policeman. But he speedily reached the end of the wood, which was of very small extent. Beyond, the plain began again. On peering from between the branches, he saw a man seated on the grass eating his breakfast. It was Jacques, the farm laborer. Nothing could be more pleasant than the corner he had chosen for his breakfast room. It was a sort of little stony ravine through which ran 2 deep wheel ruts, but carpeted with grass and moss and bordered with creepers, green-leaved, yellow, or purple, according to the caprices of that powerful colorist called autumn. The wheel ruts were full of limpid water, at the bottom of which glittered little white stones, smooth and transparent as onyx. Finally, this pretty nest was shaded by a cluster of birch trees with reddish silvery trunks and foliage light and trembling. Above this oasis spread plowed fields on which hung white and closely woven the virgin threads, floating and sparkling like an immense silver net. Jacques' breakfast consisted of a hunch of bread and a piece of cheese washed down with big draughts of cider claret, which he drank out of a stone pitcher cooled in the water of the wheel ruts. The peasant's strong white teeth buried themselves in the bread with an appetite which might have made a capitalist desire to share his frugal meal, which he only interrupted now and then to give a friendly word to his 2 horses, which a few paces off were feeding in brotherly fashion from the same wisp of hay. "He's happy, he is," murmured the murderer. Then from the depths of his conscience he added, "Yes, work, love of family, peace and happiness are there." He was tempted to accost Jacques and ask him for a piece of bread, but a glance at his tattered dress forbade him showing himself. And then it seemed to him that his features bore the stamp of his crime and must denounce him to whoever looked upon him. A sound made him turn his head, and through the branches he saw an old man covered with rags. He walked bent double, a stick in his hand and a canvas bag slung to his neck by a cord. It was a beggar. The murderer watched him with envious eyes, and again he murmured, "What would I not give to be in his place? He begs, but he is free. He goes where he pleases in the wide air, in the broad sunlight, with a calm heart, with a tranquil conscience, eating without fear and agony the bread given to him in charity, able to look behind him without seeing a dead body, beside him without dreading to find a gendarme at his elbow, before him without seeing a vision of the scaffold. Yes, he is happy, that old mendicant, and I may well envy him his lot." Suddenly he turned pale. A nervous trembling agitated all his limbs, and his features were drawn up like those of an epileptic. "There they are," he stammered, his eyes fixed upon a point in the road. With haggard eye, bewildered, mad with terror, he looked on all sides, seeking to find a place of concealment. But so strangely was he overcome by fear that his eyes saw nothing, and his mind was incapable of thought. During this time the gendarmes approached rapidly. The gallop of horses and the clanking of arms suddenly brought back to him his presence of mind, and seeing before him an elm, the foliage of which was dense enough to hide him from sight, he climbed up it with the agility of a squirrel. He was in safety when the two gendarmes halted on the road a few paces from him. He listened, motionless, terrified, a prey to emotion so violent that he could hear the beating of the heart within him. "What if we search this wood?" said one of the gendarmes. "It's too small," said the other. "It's not there that our man would take his refuge, rather in a forest. Anyhow, it will be prudent to beat it up." "No," replied his comrade, "it would be time lost, and the assassin has already a 10-hour start on us." And they went on at a trot. The murderer breathed again. He felt a renewed life. But this agony passed. A suffering for the moment forgotten made itself felt anew, and he cried, "My God, how hungry I am!" He had not eaten for 48 hours. His legs gave way under him. He was seized with giddiness and a humming in the ears. And yet he no more thought of going to the village for bread. The gendarmes, the scaffold, those two phantoms ceaselessly rose before him and overmastered even the pangs of famine. While his restless ears were on the watch for all sounds in the country, the dreary tolling of a bell made him start. It was the bell of the village church, sounding the funeral knell. The murderer listened, pale, downcast, shuddering at every stroke as if the clapper of the bell had struck upon his heart. Then big tears fell slowly from his eyes and streamed down his cheeks unobserved by him, without his making any attempt to stop their flow. It was because these funeral sounds evoked in his imagination a picture at once terrible and heartrending. At that same hour, the bell of another village church was tolling like this for another death. "Oh, wretch, wretch that I am," sighed the murderer, covering his face with both his hands. He listened again to the strokes of the church bell, which sounded to him like the sobs of the poor victim, and he murmured, "Oh, idleness! It led me to the tavern. And the tavern, this is what has come of it. 3 orphans, a poor wife in the ground, and I, a monster hateful to all, hunted like a wild beast, pursued without rest or truce until the hour when they shall have driven me to the scaffold. Horrible, horrible destiny, and yet too mild a punishment." He remained in the tree until night had come. When he saw the stars shine in the sky, when in the vast solitude around him he heard nothing but that vague breathing which seems like the respiration of the sleeping earth, then only he ventured to descend to rest himself. He stretched himself at the foot of the tree and closed his eyes, but fear which would not quit him, hunger which gnawed at his vitals, kept him constantly awake, and he rose at the first sign of dawn overwhelmed, bowed down at once by alarm, fatigue, and the fasting of nearly 3 days. End of After the Crime, Part 1. Recording by Philip Gould. Coffee Break Collection 16. Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. After the Crime by Constant Guéraud, Part 2. At the end of a few hours, his hunger, sharpened by the exciting air of the wood, ended by overcoming all his terror, and feeling that his reason was beginning to reel in his brain, he decided to go into the village in search of bread. He shook off the blades of grass which hung to his clothes, retied his neckerchief, passed his fingers through his tangled hair, then resolutely went out into the plain. 5 minutes afterwards he entered the village, walking slowly, his head bent down like a man overcome by fatigue, but casting a furtive and suspicious glance right and left, and ready to take flight at the first appearance of danger. Not far from the church, that is to say, in the center of the place, he perceived a tavern, the patriarchal aspect of which seemed to him to be reassuring. After convincing himself that neither cries nor disputes were coming from it, evidence that it was almost empty, he made up his mind to enter. "What can I give you, my good man?" asked the landlord, a solidly built peasant with broad shoulders and a frank and open countenance. "Bread and wine," replied the murderer, going and seating himself at a table near a window opening onto a garden. He was speedily served. "Here you are," said the landlord, "bread, wine, and cheese." "I only ask for bread and wine," said the murderer abruptly, hiding his face in his hands. "Oh, the cheese is of no consequence to me, nor the bread either, for, no offense to you, you don't look too well off, my poor man, and it seems to me that you need to get up your strength. So eat and drink without worrying yourself about the rest." "Thanks, thanks." At that moment the church bells began to ring loudly. "What is that?" asked the murderer. "Why are the bells ringing in that way?" "Why? Because the Mass is over." "The Mass? What is today then? Sunday? You are not a Christian then." "Oh, you'll have companions presently." The murderer felt himself becoming faint. He was tempted to rush out of the house, but a moment's reflection convinced him that such a course would ensure his certain destruction, and that prudence itself called on him to remain where he was. He had hardly come to this decision when drinkers flocked into the tavern, which presently became full. The murderer began to eat and drink, taking care to keep his face turned towards the window so as to hide his features as much as possible. A quarter of an hour passed, an age of torment and anxiety for the fugitive whom the most insignificant word caused to turn pale and to shudder. At length he was going to rise and leave the tavern when one of the drinkers cried, "Hello! Here comes Daddy Faucho, our brigadier of gendarmerie." The murderer started frightfully, and his right hand flew to his head. All his blood had rushed to his heart, and from his heart to his brain as if he had been stricken with apoplexy. He came to himself little by little, but without recovering his powers. From the shock he had sustained there remained a weakness and nervous tremor which rendered him wholly incapable of effort. On seeing the brigadier enter, he leaned his head upon the table and pretended to fall asleep. The welcome given to the gendarme attested the esteem in which he was held in the country. Everyone was eager to offer him a place at his table. "Thanks, friends," replied Daddy Faucho. "A glass is not to be refused, but as to sitting down and taking it easy with you, the service forbids." "The service, that's a good one. Today is Sunday, and thieves require a day of rest as well as other folks." "Thieves, possibly, but it's different with assassins." "Assassins? What do you mean by that, Daddy Faucho?" "Haven't you heard about the affair at Saint Didier?" "No. Tell us about it." "The more willingly because I came in here to give you all a description of the scoundrel we are hunting." The heart of the murderer throbbed heavily enough to burst his chest. "He's a stonemason named Pierre Picard," the brigadier continued. "And who has he murdered?" "His wife." "The beggar! What had she done to him?" "Cried without complaining when he beat her. Only sometimes she went to the tavern to ask him to give her some money to buy food for her little ones, whom she could not bear to see dying of starvation. That was the whole of her crime, poor creature. It was for that he killed her on Thursday night last. She was only 25. He ought to have kissed the ground she walked on, the wretch. She spent her life in working and caring for him and the children, and she had never received any other reward save blows and misery." "The infernal villain!" cried a young man, striking his fist violently on the table before him. "I'd think it a pleasure to go and see his head chopped off." That's why you all ought to know his description, so as to be able to arrest him if you come upon him. For we know that he is skulking somewhere hereabouts." There was a deep silence. The murderer, he too listened, mastering by a superhuman effort the fever raging in his blood and bewildering his brain. "This is the description of Pierre Picard," said the brigadier, unfolding a paper. "Middle height, short neck, broad shoulders, high cheekbones, large nose, black eyes, sandy beard, thin lips, a brown mole on the forehead." Folding up the paper, he added, "Now you'll be sure to recognize him if you meet him. With such a description, it would be impossible to mistake him. Then, as the song says, 'Good night, my friends, I leave you to go and hunt my game.'" The murderer ceased to breathe. While listening to the brigadier's departure, he calculated that a few hours only separated him from the frontier, and already he saw himself in safety. He was about raising his head when the heavy boots of the gendarme, taking a new direction, resounded suddenly in his ears. The gendarme stopped, 2 paces from the table at which he was seated, and the murderer felt his look turned upon him. His blood seemed to freeze in his veins. A cold perspiration burst from all his pores, and his heart appeared to him to cease beating. "By the way," cried the brigadier, "here's a party who is sleeping pretty soundly." And he struck him on the shoulder. "Hello, my friend. Hold your head up a little. I want to see your phiz." Pierre Picard raised his head sharply. The expression of his face was frightful. His livid features were horribly contracted, his bloodshot eyes darted flames, and a nervous trembling agitated his thin and close-pressed lips. "It's he!" cried 10 voices at once. The brigadier put out his hand to seize him by the collar, but before he could touch him, the murderer struck him 2 heavy blows with his fist in the eyes and blinded him. Then, springing through the window into the garden, he disappeared. Recovered from the surprise which had at first paralyzed them, 20 young men dashed off in pursuit of him. At a bound, he cleared the garden hedge, gained the fields, and in less than 10 minutes was half a league away from the village. After making sure that the unevenness of the ground prevented him from being seen, he paused for a moment to take breath, for he was quite exhausted, and would have sunk down senseless if this furious flight had continued 20 seconds longer. But he had hardly seated himself before confused cries struck upon his ears. He rose and listened. It was his pursuers. What was he to do? Exhausted, breathless, he could run no further, and they were there on his heels. He cast a desperate glance around him. Everywhere he saw the level plain, without a rock, without a hollow, without a clump of trees in which he could hide himself. Suddenly his eyes fell upon a shining pool of standing water, on the margin of which there was a growth of tall reeds, and he gasped, "Let's try it." He dragged himself to the pool, in which he hid himself up to the neck. Drawing over his head the reeds and water plants, then remained as motionless as if he had taken root in the mud. The water had become still and smooth as a mirror when the 20 peasants arrived at the edge of the pool, preceded by the brigadier, who, thanks to the care of the landlord of the tavern, had speedily recovered from the stunning effects of the blows he had received. "Now," cried Daddy Falcho, from the back of his horse, and examining the country in all directions, "where in the name of wonder can that scoundrel have got to?" "It's odd," said a young peasant. 5 minutes ago I saw him plainly, and now not a glimpse of him, and yet the ground's flat and green for 3 leagues round, without so much as a mole's hole in which he could hide his nose." "He can't be far off," said the brigadier. "Let us divide and spread over the plain, searching every bit of it, and coming back here last." Pierre Picard heard the party disperse, uttering threats against him. Still standing motionless in the pool, he trembled in every limb, and dared not change his position for fear of betraying his presence by agitating the water about him, or by deranging the reeds and water plants with which he had covered his head. He passed an hour in this position, studying the sound of the steps crossing each other on the plain, of which his ears, eagerly strained, caused the least perceptible echoes. At the end of that time, the whole of the party were again collected about the pool. "Thunder and lightning!" cried the brigadier furiously. "That brigand has escaped us, but how the plague could he have done it?" "He must be a sorcerer," said a peasant. "Sorcerer or not, I'll not give him up," replied Daddy Falcho. I'll just give Sapaju time to swallow a mouthful of water at this pool, and we'll both slip off to the edge of the frontier towards which the beggar is sure to make his way. And turning his horse towards the pool, he reined him up just at the spot where the fugitive was hidden amid the tuft of reeds. The animal stretched forward his neck, sniffed the air strongly, then quickly drew back his head and refused to advance. Pierre Picard felt the beast's warm breath upon his cheek. The brigadier gently flipped Sapaju's ears to force him to enter the pool, but the animal backed a couple of paces, and his master was unable either by blows or partings to induce him to obey. "Oh, we are in our tantrums," cried the brigadier, furious at a resistance to which he was wholly unused. "We'll see which of us is going to give in to the other." And he was preparing to flog poor Sapaju severely when, as if understanding the impending danger, the animal wheeled suddenly to the left and entered the pool some paces further off. "That's all the better for you," said the brigadier. Then, while his horse was drinking, he said to the peasants, "Now, my good fellows, you can go back to the village. I and Sapaju will see to the rest." The peasants moved off, wishing him good luck. Then the horse, having sufficiently satisfied his thirst, left the water and set off across the field, stimulated by the voice of his master. The murderer was left alone. But though he was benumbed with cold, he allowed more than a quarter of an hour to pass before venturing to quit his retreat. At length he came from the pool dripping with water, his head and shoulders covered with water grass and plants which clung to his skin and clothes, his body shivering, his face cadaverous. He cast a long glance over the deserted plain and tried to speak, but his teeth clattered together so violently that it was some moments before he could articulate a word. "Saved," he gasped at length. Then he continued with profound dejection, "Yes, saved, for the hour. But the brigadier waits for me on the frontier. The gendarmerie are warned, the whole population are on foot, and the hunt is going to begin again against the common enemy, against the mad dog. The struggle forever, the struggle without cessation, without pity, all men against me and God as well. It is too much. It is beyond my strength." While speaking, he mechanically freed himself from the slimy weeds with which he was covered. He gazed upon the solitude by which he was surrounded, and it appeared to terrify him. He seemed to feel in his heart the same cold, sullen, desolate solitude. Then he took his head between his hands and for 5 minutes remained plunged in his reflections. "So be it," he said at length in a resolute tone, and he set off in the direction of the village from which he had fled. An hour afterwards he entered the tavern where the brigadier had been so near capturing him. All the peasants who had pursued him were there. "The assassin!" they cried in bewilderment. "Yes," replied the murderer calmly. "It is Pierre Picard the assassin who has come to give himself up. Go and find the gendarmes." He seated himself in the middle of the tavern, calm and unmoved. 2 gendarmes speedily arrived. Pierre Picard recognized them as those who, the evening before, had passed close by the elm in which he had taken refuge. He held out his hands to them silently. They placed handcuffs upon his wrists and led him to a room at the mairie, which was to serve provisionally as his dungeon before he was transferred to the neighboring city. When he found himself alone, shut up securely in this prison, the door of which was guarded by 2 gendarmes, the murderer sank upon his camp bed and cried with a sort of fierce enjoyment, "At last I can rest." End of After the Crime, Part 2. Recording by Philip Gould.
Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Excerpt from Causes and Cures of Crime by Thomas Speed Mosby, published in 1913. Chapter 5, Asexualization. Nearly 40 years ago, Dr. Gideon Lidsensum appeared before the legislature of the state of Texas and advocated the asexualization of criminals as a substitute for capital punishment. His suggestion was at first received with ridicule. It has been taken more seriously with the passing of years. The modern eugenists, however, no longer advocate castration. They now recommend the operation known as vasectomy in males and oophorectomy in females, a surgical operation first performed in this country about 14 years ago, October 1899. Vasectomy, which is sometimes called Rentoul's operation, consists in the removal of a small part of each sperm duct. In the female, the operation is performed by removing a small portion of each fallopian tube. The operation is said by competent surgical authorities to be a very simple one, almost painless, and does not disqualify the patient from work for a single day. It does not destroy the means of sexual gratification, but it does effectively prevent procreation. Medical opinion is not yet unanimous as to the wisdom of this operation. Some who favor sterilization are disposed to regard castration as the more desirable method, especially in the worst class of criminals, for the reason that the sexual powers and passions still remaining after vasectomy would result in a still wider dissemination of venereal diseases. The person so sterilized would, in this sense, be more dangerous than before. His sexual passions would not be curbed, and his known condition of sterility would afford him opportunity for illicit commerce, which he would in some instances not otherwise have possessed. For, as is well known, the fear of possible fecundation in some cases is all that withholds the female consent. In these circumstances, the spread of venereal disease is certainly to be expected. As is well known, syphilis is itself a fruitful source of degeneracy. It is a more widespread and terrible scourge than tuberculosis. Warboss declares that at least 1/4 of our public institutions for caring for defectives is made necessary by venereal disease. But whatever the trend of scientific opinion, the trend of legislative opinion is all in the direction of vasectomy. In a report of Branch Committee D, read at the 4th Annual Meeting of the American Institute of Criminal Law and Criminology, the laws of the various American states which have enacted legislation upon this matter are summarized as follows. Indiana provides as a board of examiners who shall decide upon whom to operate 2 expert physicians and superintendents and boards of managers of institutions where such persons are confined. The operation may be applied to confined criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists. Several hundred operations have been done in this state. Iowa provides as a board of examiners who shall decide upon whom to operate, the managing officer of the state institution where such persons are confined, the members of the state board of parole, and the surgical consultant of such institution. The operation may be applied to habitual criminals, idiots, feeble-minded, imbeciles, drunkards, drug fiends, epileptics, and syphilitics. The operation applies to both men and women. New Jersey provides that the governor shall, with the advice of the Senate, appoint a surgeon and a neurologist, each of recognized ability, for a 5-year period, who, with the commission of charities and the superintendent of the institution, shall constitute a board of examiners, which shall decide upon whom to operate. The operation may be applied to confirmed criminals, feeble-minded, epileptics, and other defectives. Only those who cannot recover and where procreation is not advisable may be operated upon, and only after 5 days' notice by the board to the Court of Common Pleas in the county. It is lawful for any competent surgeon to operate. California provides that the superintendent of a state hospital for insane, the superintendent of a home for feeble-minded, or the resident physician of the state prison when in their opinion it would be beneficial and conducive to the benefit of the physical, mental, or moral condition of any inmate of said hospitals, home, or state prison to be asexualized, shall call the General Superintendent of State Hospitals and the Secretary of the State Board of Health. And if 2 of the 3 examiners favor the operation, it may be performed on inmate, patient, or convict. Washington provides that whenever any person shall be adjudged guilty of carnal abuse of a female person under the age of 10 years, or of rape, or shall be adjudged to be an habitual criminal, the court may, in addition to such other punishment or confinement as may be imposed, direct an operation to be performed on such person for the prevention of procreation. Connecticut provides that the directors of the state prison and the superintendent of the state hospitals for the insane are directed to appoint for each of said institutions, respectively, 2 skilled surgeons who, in conjunction with the physicians or surgeons in charge at each of said institutions, shall constitute the Board of Examiners. The majority of the board rules. The law may be applied to both men and women who would be liable to produce children with an inherent tendency to crime, insanity, feeble-mindedness, idiocy, or imbecility. New York provides that the governor shall appoint for a term of 5 years 1 surgeon, 1 neurologist, and 1 practitioner of medicine, each of 10 years' experience, who shall constitute the Board of Examiners. The law applies to feeble-minded, epileptics, criminals, and other defective inmates confined in the several state institutions. Counsel must be appointed for the persons to be operated upon, and no operation must be performed until 5 days after the order of the board has been filed with the clerk of the court, and a copy served upon the counsel appointed to represent the person examined. All orders made by the board are subject to review by the Supreme Court. A complete record must be kept by the institution where the inmate is confined. Utah has also passed a law similar to those cited. In most of these laws, provision is made for severe penalties for those who perform the required operation for improper purposes. Governor Sheldon of Nebraska, in his message to the legislature in 1909, recommended the careful consideration of the necessity for passing a law to prevent the marriage of persons unfit to propagate, and also a law for the sterilization of defectives. In Illinois, Pennsylvania, Oregon, Texas, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma, bills have been introduced for preventing increase in defectives, but have failed of enactment. The committee recommended the following, which was offered to the legislature of Wisconsin as a model statute upon the subject. Quote, the State Board of Control is hereby authorized to appoint from time to time 1 surgeon and 1 alienist of recognized ability, whose duty it shall be, in conjunction with the superintendents of the state and county institutions who have charge of criminal, insane, feeble-minded, and epileptic persons, to examine into the mental and physical condition of such persons legally confined in such institutions. Said Board of Control shall, at such times as it deems advisable, submit to such experts and the superintendent of any said institutions the names of any inmates whose mental and physical condition they desire examined, and said experts and the superintendent of said institution shall meet, take evidence, and examine into the mental and physical condition of such inmates, and report said mental and physical condition to the said State Board of Control. If such experts and superintendents unanimously find that procreation is inadvisable, it shall be lawful to perform such operation for the prevention of procreation as shall be decided safest and most effective, provided, however, that the operation shall not be performed except in such cases as are authorized by the said Board of Control. Before such operation shall be performed, it shall be the duty of the State Board of Control to give at least 30 days' notice in writing to the husband or wife, parent or guardian, if the same shall be known, and if unknown, to the person with whom such inmate last resided. The record taken upon the examination of every such inmate shall be preserved and shall be filed in the office of said Board of Control at Madison, Wisconsin, and semi-annually after the performing of the operation. The superintendent of the institution wherein such inmate is legally confined shall report to said Board of Control the condition of such inmate and the effect of such operation upon such inmate. The State Board of Control shall report biannually in its regular biennial report the number of operations performed under the authority of this Act and the result of such operations. End quote. End of excerpt from Causes and Cures of Crime by Thomas Speed Mosby, published in 1913.
Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Brooklyn Girl Robbed by Anonymous. From the New York Times, May 27, 1900. Brooklyn Girl Robbed. Masked Yosemite bandit interrupts her pleasant stage trip. Bows as he takes $50 from her. Second stage load increases his spoils. Here's a tale from the wonderful Yosemite Valley by way of Brooklyn. It concerns particularly a Brooklyn girl and a lone but bold road agent. The heroine of this story is Miss Adele Walton of 106 Willow Street, Brooklyn. About 5 weeks ago, Miss Walton, who is well known in society circles on Brooklyn Heights, went to Berkeley, California on a visit to friends. A week ago, as she states in a letter to her father, John J. Walton, she left Berkeley with a party for a trip through the Yosemite Valley. The trip was made by stagecoach. The stage had left Chinese Camp and was lumbering along toward the bridge at Big Oak Flat, through wild and lonely scenes, when a masked man suddenly appeared in the road before the coach. "Halt!" he commanded, in the traditional hoarse tone of his profession, leveling a revolver at the driver as he spoke. The driver threw up his hands and forgot to stop the horses in his hurry. The road agent, however, didn't mind this. He stopped the team himself, and then he stuck the muzzle of his ugly-looking weapon through the coach window and tersely remarked, "Tumble out." The 5 passengers, including Miss Walton, looked at the revolver and got out without comment. Everybody except a man from San Francisco promptly handed over his or her valuables and money upon demand with a nervous look at the threatening weapon. The San Francisco man pleaded to be allowed to keep $5 that he might be able to get home. "Keep $1 and walk, drat ya," said the road agent magnanimously. The San Francisco man took a lone $1 bill from his pocketbook and with a sigh pocketed it, handing the rest over to the bandit. Miss Walton contributed $50 to the robber's spoils. He accepted the money from her, she writes, with a Chesterfieldian bow. The total of the money obtained by the man amounted to only $125, and he was apparently much disgusted. "This will keep me in chewin' tobacco for a while anyway," he remarked with scorn. Just then, another stage, traveling in the opposite direction, came up and the driver stopped to inquire what the trouble was. "Oh, I see," he gasped, as the highwayman's weapon was pointed at him in answer. The road agent, thinking that with 2 stage loads on his hands somebody might get troublesome, ordered the first coach to proceed. Then he calmly relieved the 4 passengers in the second stage of their money, but got only $120 more. The robber then went his way, and the second stage resumed its journey. When Miss Walton reached Sonora, she communicated with her friends at Berkeley and informed them of her plight. The day after the robbery, 2 men were arrested at Oakdale, California, and charged with the crime, but they proved their innocence and were released. End of Brooklyn Girl Robbed. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Coffee Break Collection 16. Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. Captain Charles Bellamy by Philip Goss from The Pirates Who's Who. Pirate, socialist, and orator, a famous West Indian filibuster. He began life as a wrecker in the West Indies, but this business being uncertain in its profits, and Bellamy being an ambitious young man, he decided with his partner, Paul Williams, to aim at higher things, and to enter the profession of piracy. Bellamy had now chosen a calling that lent itself to his undoubted talents, and his future career, while it lasted, was a brilliant one. Procuring a ship, he sailed up and down the coast of Carolina and New England, taking and plundering numerous vessels, and when this neighborhood became too hot for him, he would cruise for a while in the cooler climate of Newfoundland. Bellamy had considerable gifts for public speaking, and seldom missed an opportunity of addressing the assembled officers and crews of the ships he took, before liberating or otherwise disposing of them. His views were distinctly socialistic. On one occasion, in an address to a Captain Beer, who had pleaded to have his sloop returned to him, Captain Bellamy, after clearing his throat, began as follows. "I am sorry," he said, "that you can't have your sloop again, for I scorn to do anyone any mischief, when it is not to my advantage, though you are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security, for the cowardly whelps have not the courage otherwise to defend what they get by their knavery. But damn ye altogether for a pack of crafty rascals, and you who serve them for a parcel of hen-hearted numbskulls. They vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is the only difference that they rob the poor under cover of the law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Had you not better make one of us than sneak after these villains for employment?" Bellamy's fall came at last at the hands of a whaler captain. At the time he was in command of the Huiga and a small fleet of other pirate craft, which was lying at anchor in the Bay of Placentia in Newfoundland. Sailing from Placentia for Nantucket Shoals, he seized a whaling vessel, the Mary Ann. As the skipper of the whaler knew the coast well, Bellamy made him pilot of his small fleet. The cunning skipper one night ran his ship onto a sandbank near Eastman, Massachusetts, and the rest of the fleet followed his stern, light onto the rocks. Almost all the crews perished, only 7 of the pirates being saved. These were seized and brought to trial, condemned and hanged at Boston in 1726. The days spent between the sentence and the hanging were not wasted, for we read in a contemporary account that by the indefatigable pains of a pious and learned divine who constantly attended them, they were at length, by the special grace of God, made sensible of and truly penitent for the enormous crimes they had been guilty of. End of Captain Charles Bellamy by Philip Goss.
Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Circumstantial account of the life, trial, piracies, and execution of Captain John Kidd, who was hanged at Execution Dock, by William Jackson. The case of Captain Kidd, while in agitation, engaged the attention of the public in a very eminent degree, though the man himself was one of the most contemptible of the human race. the town of Greenock in Scotland gave birth to Captain Kidd, who was bred to the sea, and having quitted his native country, he resided in New York, where he became owner of a small vessel, with which he traded among the pirates, obtained a thorough knowledge of their haunts, and could give a better account of them than any other person whatever. He was neither remarkable for the excess of his courage nor for his want of it. In a word, his ruling passion appeared to be avarice, and to this was owing his connection with the pirates. When Kidd was in company with these abandoned people, he used to converse and act as they did. Yet at other times he would make singular professions of honesty, and intimate how easy a matter it would be to extirpate these people, and prevent their making further depredations. His frequent remarks of this kind engaged the notice of several considerable planters, who, forming a more favorable idea of him than his true character would warrant, procured him the patronage with which he was afterwards honored. Before we enter into further particulars respecting this man, it will be proper to say something of the situation of public affairs previous to, and at the time he began to grow conspicuous. For years past, great complaints had been made of the piracies committed in the West Indies, which had been greatly encouraged by some of the inhabitants of North America, on account of the advantage that could be made by the purchase of effects thus fraudulently obtained. This coming to the knowledge of King William III, he, in the year 1695, bestowed the government of New England and New York on the Earl of Bellamont, an Irish nobleman of distinguished character and abilities. As soon as his Majesty had conferred this honor on Lord Bellamont, his lordship began to consider of the most effectual method to redress the evils complained of, and he represented to Colonel Livingston, a gentleman who had great property in New York, that some proper steps should be taken to obviate the evils so long complained of. Just at this juncture, Captain Kidd was arrived from New York in a sloop of his own. Him, therefore, the Colonel mentioned to Lord Bellamont as a bold and daring man, who was very fit to be employed against the pirates, as he was perfectly well acquainted with the places which they resorted at. This plan met with the fullest approbation of his lordship, who, knowing how desirous the king was that this nest of pirates should be destroyed, mentioned the affair to his Majesty, who greatly applauded the design and recommended it to the notice of the Board of Admiralty. The commissioners likewise approved it, but such were then the hurry and confusion of public affairs, that though the design was approved, no steps were taken towards carrying it into execution. The transactions on this head being imparted to Colonel Livingston, he made an application to Lord Bellamont and informed him that as the affair would not well admit of delay, it was worthy of being undertaken by some private persons of rank and distinction, and carried into execution at their own expense, notwithstanding public encouragement was denied it. Lord Bellamont approved of this project, but it was attended with considerable difficulty. At length, however, the Lord Chancellor Somers, the Duke of Shrewsbury, the Earl of Romney, the Earl of Oxford, and some other persons, with Colonel Livingston and Captain Kidd, agreed to raise £6,000 for the expense of the voyage, and the colonel and captain were to have a fifth of the profits of the whole undertaking. This plan was so highly approved of by King William, who thought it would produce such great advantages to his subjects, that he promised to contribute to its success, and therefore a reserve was agreed to be made of a tenth part of the effects seized from the pirates, for the use of his Majesty. But after the contract was concluded, the king could not spare his share of the money, and therefore the whole was advanced by the above-mentioned persons. Matters being thus far adjusted, a commission in the usual form was granted to Captain Kidd to take and seize pirates and bring them to justice, but there was no special clause or proviso to restrain his conduct or regulate the mode of his proceeding. Kidd was known to Lord Bellamont, and another gentleman presented him to Lord Romney. With regard to the other parties concerned, he was wholly unacquainted with them, and so ill was this affair conducted that he had no private instruction how to act, but received his sailing orders from Lord Bellamont, the purport of which was that he should act agreeable to the letter of his commission. Accordingly, a vessel was purchased and manned and received the name of the Adventure Galley, and in this Captain Kidd sailed for New York towards the close of the year 1695, and in his passage made a prize of a French ship. From New York he sailed to the Madeira Islands, thence to Bonavisto and St. Jago, and from this last place to Madagascar. He now began to cruise at the entrance of the Red Sea, but not being successful in those latitudes, he sailed to Calicut, and there took a ship of 150 tons burden, which he carried to Madagascar and disposed of there. Having sold his prize, he again put to sea, and at the expiration of 5 weeks took the Quetta Merchant, a ship of above 400 tons burden, the master of which was an Englishman named Wright, who had 2 Dutch mates on board and a French gunner. But the crew consisted of Moors, natives of Africa, and were about 90 in number. He carried this ship to St. Mary's near Madagascar, where he burnt the Adventure galley belonging to his owners, and divided the lading of the Quetta Merchant with his crew, taking 40 shares to himself. They then went on board the last mentioned ship and sailed for the West Indies. It is uncertain whether the inhabitants of the West India Islands knew that Kidd was a pirate, but he was refused refreshments at Anguilla and St. Thomas's, and therefore sailed to Mona between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, where through the management of an Englishman named Bolton he obtained a supply of provisions from Curacao. He now bought a sloop of Bolton, in which he stowed great parts of his ill-gotten effects, and left the Quetta Merchant with 18 of the ship's company in Bolton's care. While at St. Mary's, 90 men of Kidd's crew left him and went on board the Mocha Merchant, an East India ship which had just then commenced pirate. Kidd now sailed in the sloop and touched at several places, where he disposed of a great part of his cargo, and then steered for Boston in New England. In the interim, Bolton sold the Quetta Merchant to the Spaniards, and immediately sailed as a passenger in a ship for Boston, where he arrived a considerable time before Kidd and gave information of what happened to Lord Bellamont, then the resident governor. Kidd, therefore, on his arrival, was seized by order of his lordship, when all he had to urge in his defense was that he thought the Quetta Merchant was a lawful prize, as she was manned with Moors, though there was no kind of proof that this vessel had committed any act of piracy. Upon this, the Earl of Bellamont immediately dispatched an account to England of the circumstances that had arisen, and requested that a ship might be sent for Kidd, who had committed several other notorious acts of piracy. The ship Rochester was accordingly sent to bring him to England, but this vessel happening to be disabled, was obliged to return, a circumstance which greatly increased the public clamor which had for some time subsisted respecting this affair. It is not to be doubted but this clamor took its rise from party prejudice, yet it was carried to such a height that the members of Parliament for several places were instructed to move the House for an inquiry into the affair, and accordingly it was moved in the House of Commons that the letters patent granted to the Earl of Bellamont and others respecting the goods taken from pirates were dishonorable to the King, against the law of nations, contrary to the laws and statutes of this realm, an invasion of property and destructive to commerce. Though a negative was put on this motion, yet the enemies of Lord Somers and the Earl of Oxford continued to charge those noblemen with giving countenance to pirates, and it was even insinuated that the Earl of Bellamont was not less culpable than the actual offenders. Another motion was accordingly made in the House of Commons to address His Majesty that Kidd might not be tried till the next session of Parliament, and that the Earl of Bellamont might be directed to send home all examinations and other papers relative to the affair. This motion was carried, and the King complied with the request which was made. As soon as Kidd arrived in England, he was sent for and examined at the bar of the House of Commons, with a view to fix part of his guilt on the parties who had been concerned in sending him on the expedition, but nothing arose to criminate any of those distinguished persons. Kidd, who was in some degree intoxicated, made a very contemptible appearance at the bar of the House, on which a member who had been one of the most earnest to have him examined violently exclaimed, "Damn this fellow, I thought he had been only a knave, but unfortunately he happens to be a fool likewise." Kidd was at length tried at the Old Bailey and was convicted on the clearest evidence, but neither at that time nor afterwards charged any of his employers with being privy to his infamous proceedings. He was hanged at Execution Dock on the 23rd day of May 1701, but a circumstance happened at his execution that will be worthy of recital. After he had been tied up to the gallows, the rope broke, and he fell to the ground. But being immediately tied up again, the ordinary, who had before exhorted him, desired to speak with him once more, and on this second application entreated him to make the most careful use of the few further moments thus providentially allotted him, for the final preparation of his soul to meet its important change. These exhortations appeared to have the wished-for effect, and he was left professing his charity to all the world and his hopes of salvation through the merits of his Redeemer. In this manner ended the life of Captain Kidd, a man who, if he had entertained a proper regard to the welfare of the public, or even to his own advantage, might have become a useful member of society instead of a disgrace to it. The opportunities he had obtained of acquiring a complete knowledge of the haunts of the pirates rendered him one of the most proper men in the world to have extirpated this nest of villains, but his own avarice defeated the generous views of some of the greatest and most distinguished men of the age in which he lived. Hence we may learn the destructive nature of avarice, which generally counteracts all its own purposes. Captain Kidd might have acquired a fortune and rendered material service to his country, in a point the most essential to its interests, but he appeared to be dead to all those generous sensations which do honor to humanity, and materially injured his country, while he was bringing final disgrace on himself. The history of this wretched malefactor will effectually impress on the mind of the reader the truth of the old observation, that honesty is the best policy. Henceforth let honor's path be trod, nor villains seek in vain to mock the sacred laws of God and give their neighbors pain. End of the circumstantial account of the life, trial, piracies, and execution of Captain John Kidd, who was hanged at Execution Dock. Recording by Philip Gould. Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Correspondence with the Emperor Trajan by Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus. 97. To the Emperor Trajan. Footnote. This letter is esteemed as almost the only genuine monument of ecclesiastical antiquity relating to the times immediately succeeding the apostles, it being written at most not above 40 years after the death of St. Paul. It was preserved by the Christians themselves as a clear and unsuspicious evidence of the purity of their doctrines, and is frequently appealed to by the early writers of the Church against the calumnies of their adversaries. End footnote. It is my invariable rule, sir, to refer to you in all matters where I feel doubtful, for who is more capable of removing my scruples or informing my ignorance? Having never been present at any trials concerning those who profess Christianity, I am unacquainted not only with the nature of their crimes or the measure of their punishment, but how far it is proper to enter into an examination concerning them. Whether, therefore, any difference is usually made with respect to ages, or no distinction is to be observed between the young and the adult. Whether repentance entitles them to a pardon, or if a man has been once a Christian, it avails nothing to desist from his errors. Whether the very profession of Christianity unattended with any criminal act, or only the crimes themselves inherent in the profession are punishable. On all these points I am in great doubt. In the meanwhile, the method I have observed toward those who have been brought before me as Christians is this. I asked them whether they were Christians. If they admitted it, I repeated the question twice and threatened them with punishment. If they persisted, I ordered them to be at once punished, for I was persuaded whatever the nature of their opinions might be, a contumacious and inflexible obstinacy certainly deserved correction. There were others also brought before me possessed with the same infatuation, but being Roman citizens, I directed them to be sent to Rome. Footnote. It was one of the privileges of a Roman citizen secured by the Semprurian law that he could not be capitally convicted but by the suffrage of the people, which seems to have been still so far in force as to make it necessary to send the persons here mentioned to Rome. End footnote. But this crime spreading, as is usually the case, while it was actually under prosecution, several instances of the same nature occurred. An anonymous information was laid before me containing a charge against several persons who upon examination denied they were Christians or had ever been so. They repeated after me an invocation to the gods and offered religious rites with wine and incense before your statue, which for that purpose I had ordered to be brought together with those of the gods, and even reviled the name of Christ, whereas there is no forcing, it is said, those who are really Christians into any of these compliances. I thought it proper, therefore, to discharge them. Some among those who were accused by a witness in person at first confessed themselves Christians, but immediately after denied it. The rest owned indeed that they had been of that number formerly, but had now, some above 3, others more, and a few above 20 years ago, renounced that error. They all worshipped your statue and the images of the gods, uttering imprecations all the time against the name of Christ. They affirmed the whole of their guilt or their error was that they met on a stated day before it was light and addressed a form of prayer to Christ as to a divinity, binding themselves by a solemn oath not for the purposes of any wicked design, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to eat in common a harmless meal. From this custom, however, they desisted after the publication of my edict, by which, according to your commands, I forbade the meeting of any assemblies. After receiving this account, I judged it so much the more necessary to endeavor to extort the real truth by putting 2 female slaves to the torture who were said to officiate in their religious rites. But all I could discover was evidence of an absurd and extravagant superstition. I deemed it expedient, therefore, to adjourn all further proceedings in order to consult you, for it appears to be a matter highly deserving your consideration, more especially as great numbers must be involved in the danger of these prosecutions, which have already extended and are still likely to extend to persons of all ranks and ages, and even of both sexes. In fact, this contagious superstition is not confined to the cities only, but has spread its infection among the neighboring villages and country. Nevertheless, it still seems possible to restrain its progress. The temples, at least, which were once almost deserted, begin now to be frequented, and the sacred rites, after a long intermission, are again revived, while there is a general demand for the victims, which till lately found very few purchasers. From all this, it is easy to conjecture what numbers might be reclaimed if a general pardon were granted to those who shall repent of their error. Footnote. These women, it is supposed, exercise the same office as Phoebe mentioned by St. Paul, whom he styles deaconess of the Church of Cenchrea. Their business was to tend the poor and sick, and other charitable offices, as also to assist at the ceremony of female baptism for the more decent performance of that rite, as Vossius observes upon this passage. In footnote. 98. Trajan to Pliny. You have adopted the right course, my dearest Secundus, in investigating the charges against the Christians who were brought before you. It is not possible to lay down any general rule for all such cases. Do not go out of your way to look for them. If indeed they should be brought before you and the crime is proved, they must be punished, with the restriction, however, that where the party denies he is a Christian and shall make it evident that he is not by invoking our gods, let him, notwithstanding any former suspicion, be pardoned upon his repentance. Footnote. If we impartially examine this prosecution of the Christians, we shall find it to have been grounded on the ancient constitution of the state, and not to have proceeded from a cruel or arbitrary temper in Trajan. The Roman legislature appears to have been early jealous of any innovation in point of public worship, and we find the magistrates during the Old Republic frequently interposing in cases of that nature. Valerius Maximus has collected some instances to that purpose, and Livy mentions it as an established principle of the earlier ages of the Commonwealth, to guard against the introduction of foreign ceremonies of religion. It was an old and fixed maxim likewise of the Roman government not to suffer any unlicensed assemblies of the people. From hence it seems evident that the Christians had rendered themselves obnoxious not so much to Trajan as to the ancient and settled laws of the state, by introducing a foreign worship and assembling themselves without authority. End footnote. Anonymous informations ought not to be received in any sort of prosecution. It is introducing a very dangerous precedent and is quite foreign to the spirit of our age. End of correspondence with the Emperor Trajan. Recording by Philip Gould.
Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Aeneas O'Hagan, The Irish Outlaw by S.W. From the Dublin Penny Journal, Volume 4, May 7, 1836. Mr. Editor, since you are raking up so much antiquated information respecting Ireland in the olden time, I presume the following will be both acceptable to you and interesting to your readers. In making out the following sketch, I am assisted by innumerable traditions, together with some printed documents, all which agree in the main particulars, and this leads me to think that there is credibility to be attached to the whole. Know then that the parents of Nias O'Hagan, commonly pronounced Nias O'Hagan, lived about the close of the 17th century at a place named Skerry, a short distance to the north of Slemish Mountain in the county of Antrim. They had 4 sons, Shane Oge, Aeneas, Dennis. The name of the other is forgotten. It appears that the mother was unable to nurse any of them, and that a nurse was provided for that purpose, and whether or not anything of the disposition of the foster mother was imbibed into the children with her milk, one strange fact is that her own son and the 4 O'Hagans were all hanged. The parents had a practice of setting the barn doors open, and, each with a stick, stood inside one of the doors and thrashed on the floor. They then caused their sons to run in at the one door and out at the other, and he that was nimblest got fewest strokes. This was for the purpose of training them to activity. It appears that the mother was of a more daring spirit than the father, and that she sometimes reproached her sons for their lack of courage, and incited them to acts which, but for her, they might never have attempted. When the 3 eldest came to be men, they betook themselves to a life of robbery, and committed great depredations in the northern parts of the county of Antrim, and had caves in several places where they concealed themselves, some of which are yet shown about Ballyboley Mountain and Glenwherry, and are called O'Hagan's Caves. They also had a place of concealment at a place called Archie's Bushes on the Knockhock Mountain near Carrickfergus. When they were near this latter place, they found asylum in the house of a widow of a degraded Presbyterian minister named Gideon Jacques, and sometimes in the house of a James McKinstry. The youngest brother had not at this time joined them, but his mother began to upbraid him for not making common cause with his brothers and living like a gentleman. He hereupon betook himself to the residence of his brothers, by whom he was joyfully received. The first robbery which they committed after this turned out badly for the young recruit, for he clothed himself with the apparel of the man they had robbed, which, being identified, he was apprehended, tried, and executed, while his brothers were lying in view of the melancholy scene. Shane Oge was next apprehended and executed. It appears that McKinstry, the former friend of the gang, betrayed him. Nias was with him when he was captured, but made his escape. A number of country people attempted to surround him, but they dreaded the true leveling of his gun, so that none of them durst appear in his path. However, one young man ventured to look from behind a tree, when immediately a bullet from the robber's gun took away one side of the brim of his hat and part of his ear. Aeneas, having reloaded his gun, effected his retreat. He had now to change his abode to Cullen Mountain, where he plundered the farmers at a fearful rate. At last his retreat at this place was also discovered, and the peasantry sallied forth in a body to apprehend him. Nias, perceiving their approach, thought proper to consult his safety by flight, but a man named Gillenan, being mounted on a fleet mare, soon overtook him. O'Hagan supplicated him for mercy, as he had never injured him or his family. His boon was granted, either through dread of the robber should he escape, or from motives of humanity. He ran his mare into a bog, and thus suffered him to escape. He, being very swift, soon left his pursuers, and continued his flight till he arrived at Lord Antrim's deer park, the wall of which he leapt, but in doing so he broke one of his legs. However, he was successful this time also in baffling his pursuers. It appears that after this he changed the seat of his operations to the Belfast Mountains, where his name and exploits caused universal alarm, and though his brothers were all at this time dead, yet he was not without companions, as we find him and his gang on one Sabbath evening coming to the house of a man named Gilmore, near the village of Roughfort, with an intention of robbing. O'Hagan left the others at some distance and went forward to reconnoiter. The old man and his family were singing psalms. This struck such a terror on the robber's mind that when he returned to his companions, he told them that they would do nothing that night, as Gilmore was better employed than they were, and if they robbed him, they could never prosper afterwards. At one time, before the Lammas Fair of Belfast, he prepared a great quantity of ropes, and when the people about Ballinabernice and in the neighborhood of Temple Patrick were on their way to the fair, he and an accomplice waylaid them on the mountain, robbed them and bound them, and so effectually did he scour the hills that day and detained all whom he saw, that not one escaped to give information. When it came near night, he left them, and some one coming forward unbound one, the two then unbound two more, and so on. The small glen where he had them all lying is to this day called O'Hagan's Howe. There was an old man named Allison who lived in the vicinity of Squire's Hill, with whom it appears that O'Hagan was very intimate. It is also said that he paid O'Hagan some kind of blackmail, that he might not disturb him. He also left his barn door unlocked, that O'Hagan, when he pleased, might get a free night's lodging, and sometimes he left a cheese or other provisions for his acceptance. On the other hand, these acts of kindness were not overlooked by the robber, for if at any time he knew of Allison being in straits for money, he would have tied up a few guineas and hung them at the handle of his door during the night. He appeared very seldom to Allison, and when they did meet, O'Hagan told him that if ever he saw him about his house, he must not look which way he went, as their correspondence must cease, for he did not wish any person to be acquainted with more than one of his haunts. After the lapse of upwards of a century, it is not to be expected that all the exploits of this man can be enumerated. However, it appears that his robberies were so numerous that the greatest part of the county of Antrim got alarmed, and in a short time he was outlawed and a reward offered for his head, whether dead or alive, and parties of military were sometimes sent in pursuit of him. At one time, when he was on some excursion to his native place, some dragoons, being informed of it, set out in pursuit of him. He immediately betook himself to flight, and being by nature very fleet, and knowing the country better than they, he kept before them till he passed Devis Mountain, and when he came to the river Lagan, which divides the counties of Down and Antrim, he fairly jumped over it. An old man who was plowing on the opposite side told him that he had lived there during a long life, and that he had never seen the like done before. "That may be," said O'Hagan, "but perhaps you never saw one trying it before who had 20 long miles of a race to it." The country was now getting too hot for him, and he enlisted under a fictitious name. Being now missed from his old haunts, much conjecture was afloat what could have become of O'Hagan. However, one day while his regiment was in England, the men were diverting themselves by jumping, and one set up 2 horses with a man on each and jumped over them. O'Hagan then set up 3 and jumped over them with the same ease. But unfortunately for him, one of the dragoons who had given him the long chase in Ireland was present and immediately called out that he had never seen anyone who could do the like but Nias O'Hagan. On hearing his former name mentioned, O'Hagan's countenance fell, and he was immediately suspected, taken up, and examined. And so minutely had he been described in the proclamations in Ireland that a flesh mark on some part of his body proved him to be the same man. He was hereupon transmitted to Carrickfergus and charges brought against him, which caused him to be sentenced to death. On the day of his execution, while walking from the prison to the gallows, a distance of a mile, he told an acquaintance on what part of the Belfast mountains his money was concealed. A man named Johnson overheard his discourse, and, knowing the place, immediately galloped off without waiting for the execution, and so great was his haste that his horse broke down and died near the Cave Hill. However, he arrived at the place on foot, and just as he had possessed himself of the booty, O'Hagan's friend appeared, though too late. The tradition states that there was the full of a boot of guineas. Another report states that it was a servant of Lord Antrim's who identified O'Hagan in England. It is also stated that Mr. Johnson paid him a yearly contribution while he haunted the Belfast mountains, and that he paid him a visit when he was going to be executed, and that he told himself and none else where his money lay, but the difference between the 2 relations is by no means important. The place where the money was found is shown to this day. It is a cairn of stones on the roadside from Temple Patrick to Belfast, in the townland of Ballytuig and parish of Temple Patrick. at the spot formerly grew a thorn called the hanging thorn from someone committing suicide on it. According to the record book of Carrickfergus, it was in the year 1720 that Nias O'Hagan was apprehended. The bolts that were purposely forged for him are yet in Carrickfergus jail. As the O'Hagans were severally executed, their heads were placed on spikes on the top of the courthouse. Shortly after the head of Shane O'Gay was stuck up, an eagle tore out his eyes, and in about 2 years afterwards, a wren hatched a brood of young in the interior of his skull. After these heads had remained on the spikes for a number of years, they were blown down the chimney of a neighboring schoolroom, the master of which kept them carefully to frighten those of his pupils who were inattentive. There were several other vague traditions extant respecting this race of freebooters, but I have suppressed them as I do not wish to make statements which I do not believe to be true. S.W., Shanes Hill near Temple Patrick. End of Nias O'Hagan, the Irish Outlaw. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Coffee Break Collection, 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. The Female Criminal by Clarence Darrow. Women furnish only 1/5 to 1/10 of the population of penal institutions. Probably the percentage would be still lower if among these were not a number of rather common convictions for acts which are peculiar to women, like abortion, infanticide, child abandonment, and the like. As to the other crimes, few women are burglars or robbers or guilty of other crimes of violence, except murder. Women steal and poison and blackmail and extort money and lie and slander and gossip, and probably cause as much unhappiness as men. But their crimes, like their lives, are not on so large or adventurous a scale. They do not so readily take a chance. They lack the imagination that makes big criminals or lays broad schemes. In many of their crimes, they are often the accomplices of men and take rather a minor part, although sometimes a quite important one. For this reason, they are often not detected and frequently not prosecuted, a fact which leaves the percentage smaller than it otherwise would be. Then, too, juries are apt to acquit women of crime even when they are indicted and tried. It must be a positive case and one which calls for no possible feeling of sympathy or where there is no personal appeal that will work the conviction of a woman. Men have so long adopted an attitude of chivalry toward women that very few juries will convict them. This, too, has much to do with the small number of female convicts. Some writers claim that the small number of women in penal institutions shows that women are better than men, but this is a hasty conclusion arrived at from insufficient facts. There are fewer female prisoners because women have lived a more protected life. They have not been engaged so generally in business. They have not been so constantly obliged to fight their way in the world. Their lives have been more quiet and smooth. They have been surrounded by strong conventions and closely watched. Especially is this true with regard to the girl as compared with the boy. Such protection naturally keeps them from the commission of crime. The great consideration shown to them by prosecuting witnesses, prosecuting officers, judges, and juries supplements the protected life and is an added reason for the showing made by statistics. It is notorious that a woman is seldom convicted of murder. This has been the subject of much complaint on the part of the public. Still, a man may condemn such acquittals and, when placed on a jury, will himself vote for acquittal. After all, the juries are right. Most of the cases of murder against women involve sex relations. Nature has made the bearing and rearing of children first of all the woman's part, and this fact so dominates her life that nothing else seems important to her in comparison. She is not able to judge in a broad and scientific way matters so clearly affecting a life. It may even be possible that in the evolution and preservation of life, her judgments are right. At least they are the natural judgments for a large number of women. or these tragedies would not occur. No doubt as woman enters the field of industry, formerly monopolized by man, and as she takes her part in politics and sits on juries, the percentage of female criminals will rapidly increase. In fact, the percentage of women prisoners has been climbing for many years. As she takes her place with men, she will be more and more judged as men are judged, and will commit the crimes that men commit, and perhaps furnish her fair quota to the penitentiaries and jails. Whether this will be better or worse for the race is no part of the discussion, and can only be told by long experience. Women must accept the facts and make their choice of activities in view of these facts. Quite apart from any sentiment, I think that it is a mistake to believe that men and women should be judged alike. The structure and nervous system of women cause physical and mental disturbances which affect their judgment and life. If there were any judgment in human judgment and civilization, then each human being would be judged according to his makeup, his tendencies, his inclinations, and his capacities, and no two would be judged alike. Any sudden change in the treatment of women in the courts will work a great injustice that will leave its effect on both women and men, and still more on the life of the race. End of The Female Criminal.
Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How Knuth Would Have Practiced His Art Upon the Knolls by Edward J.M.D. Plunkett, Lord Dunsany. Despite the advertisements of rival firms, it is probable that every tradesman knows that nobody in business at the present time has a position equal to that of Mr. Knuth. To those outside the magic circle of business, his name is scarcely known. He does not need to advertise. He is consummate. He is superior even to modern competition, and whatever claims they boast, his rivals know it. His terms are moderate, so much cash down when the goods are delivered, so much in blackmail afterwards. He consults your convenience. His skill may be counted upon. I have seen a shadow on a windy night move more noisily than Knuth, for Knuth is a burglar by trade. Men have been known to stay in country houses and to send a dealer afterwards to bargain for a piece of tapestry that they saw there, some article of furniture, some picture. This is bad taste, but those whose culture is more elegant invariably send Knuth a night or two after their visit. He has a way with tapestry. You would scarcely notice that the edges had been cut. And often when I see some huge new house full of old furniture and portraits from other ages, I say to myself, these moldering chairs, these full-length ancestors, and carved mahogany are the produce of the incomparable Knuth. It may be urged against my use of the word incomparable that in the burglary business the name of Slith stands paramount and alone. Of this I am not ignorant, but Slith is a classic and lived long ago, and knew nothing at all of modern competition. Besides which, the surprising nature of his doom has possibly cast a glamour upon Slith that exaggerates in our eyes his undoubted merits. It must not be thought that I am a friend of Knuth's. On the contrary, such politics as I have are on the side of property, and he needs no words from me, for his position is almost unique in trade, being among the very few that do not need to advertise. At the time that my story begins, Knuth lived in a roomy house in Belgrave Square. In his inimitable way, he had made friends with the caretaker. The place suited Knuth, and whenever anyone came to inspect it before purchase, the caretaker used to praise the house in the words that Knuth had suggested. If it wasn't for the drains, she would say, it's the finest house in London. And when they pounced on this remark and asked questions about the drains, she would answer them that the drains also were good, but not so good as the house. They did not see Knuth when they went over the rooms, but Knuth was there. Here, in a neat black dress on one spring morning, came an old woman whose bonnet was lined with red, asking for Mr. Knuth. And with her came her large and awkward son. Mrs. Eggins, the caretaker, glanced up the street, and then she let them in and left them to wait in the drawing room amongst furniture all mysterious with sheets. For a long while they waited, and then there was a smell of pipe tobacco, and there was Knuth standing quite close to them. Lord, said the old woman, whose bonnet was lined with red, you did make me start. And then she saw by his eyes that that was not the way to speak to Mr. Nuth. And at last Nuth spoke, and very nervously the old woman explained that her son was a likely lad and had been in business already, but wanted to better himself. And she wanted Mr. Nuth to teach him a livelihood. First of all, Nuth wanted to see a business reference, and when he was shown one from a jeweler with whom he happened to be hand in glove, the upshot of it was that he agreed to take young Tonker, for this was the surname of the likely lad, and to make him his apprentice. And the old woman, whose bonnet was lined with red, went back to her little cottage in the country, and every evening said to her old man, Tonker, we must fasten the shutters of a night time, for Tommy's a burglar now. The details of the likely lad's apprenticeship I do not propose to give, for those that are in the business know those details already, and those that are in other businesses care only for their own, while men of leisure who have no trade at all would fail to appreciate the gradual degrees by which Tommy Tonker came first to cross bare boards, covered with little obstacles in the dark without making any sound, and then to go silently up creaky stairs, and then to open doors, and lastly to climb. Let it suffice that the business prospered greatly, while glowing reports of Tommy Tonker's progress were sent from time to time to the old woman, whose bonnet was lined with red, in the laborious handwriting of Nuth. Nuth had given up lessons in writing very early, for he seemed to have some prejudice against forgery, and therefore considered writing a waste of time. And then came the transaction with Lord Castlenorman at his Surrey residence. Nuth selected a Saturday night, for it chanced that Saturday was observed as Sabbath in the family of Lord Castlenorman, and by 11 o'clock the whole house was quiet. 5 minutes before midnight, Tommy Tonker, instructed by Mr. Nuth, who waited outside, came away with one pocketful of rings and shirt studs. It was quite a light pocketful, but the jewelers in Paris could not match it without sending specially to Africa, so that Lord Castlenorman had to borrow Bone's shirt studs. Not even rumor whispered the name of Nuth. Were I to say that this turned his head, there are those to whom the assertion would give pain, for his associates hold that his astute judgment was unaffected by circumstance. I will say, therefore, that it spurred his genius to plan what no burglar had ever planned before. It was nothing less than to burgle the house of the Knowles, and that this abstemious man unfolded to Tonker over a cup of tea. Had Tonker not been nearly insane with pride over their recent transaction, and had he not been blinded by a veneration for Nuth, he would have, but I cry over spilled milk. He expostulated respectfully. He said he would rather not go. He said it was not fair. He allowed himself to argue, and in the end, one windy October morning with a menace in the air, found him and Nuth drawing near to the dreadful wood. Nuth, by weighing little emeralds against pieces of common rock, had ascertained the probable weight of those house ornaments that the Knowles are believed to possess in the narrow, lofty house wherein they have dwelt from of old. They decided to steal 2 emeralds and to carry them between them on a cloak, but if they should be too heavy, one must be dropped at once. Nuth warned young Tonker against greed and explained that the emeralds were worth less than cheese until they were safe away from the dreadful wood. Everything had been planned, and they walked now in silence. No track led up to the sinister gloom of the trees, either of men or cattle. Not even a poacher had been there snaring elves for over 100 years. You did not trespass twice in the dells of the Knowles. And, apart from the things that were done there, the trees themselves were a warning, and did not wear the wholesome look of those that we plant ourselves. The nearest village was some miles away, with the backs of all its houses turned to the wood, and without one window at all facing in that direction. They did not speak of it there, and elsewhere it is unheard of. Into this wood stepped Nuth and Tommy Tonker. They had no firearms. Tonker had asked for a pistol, but Nuth replied that the sound of a shot would bring everything down on us, and so no more was said about it. Into the wood they went all day, deeper and deeper. They saw the skeleton of some early Georgian poacher nailed to a door in an oak tree. Sometimes they saw a fairy scuttle away from them. Once Tonker stepped heavily on a hard, dry stick, after which they both lay still for 20 minutes. And the sunset flared full of omens through the tree trunks, and night fell, and they came by fitful starlight, as Nuth had foreseen, to that lean, high house where the Knowles so secretly dwelt. All was so silent by that undervalued house that the faded courage of Tonker flickered up. But to Knuth's experienced sense, it seemed too silent. And all the while there was that look in the sky that was worse than a spoken doom, so that Knuth, as is often the case when men are in doubt, had leisure to fear the worst. Nevertheless, he did not abandon the business, but sent the likely lad with the instruments of his trade by means of the ladder to the old green casement. And the moment that Tonker touched the withered boards, the silence that, although ominous, was earthly, became unearthly, like the touch of a ghoul. And Tonker heard his breath offending against that silence, and his heart was like mad drums in a night attack, and a string of one of his sandals went tap on a rung of a ladder, and the leaves of the forest were mute, and the breeze of the night was still. And Tonker prayed that a mouse or a mole might make any noise at all, but not a creature stirred. Even Knuth was still. And then and there, while yet he was undiscovered, the likely lad made up his mind, as he should have done long before, to leave those colossal emeralds where they were, and to have nothing further to do with the lean, high house of the Knowles, but to quit this sinister wood in the nick of time and retire from business at once and buy a place in the country. Then he descended softly and beckoned to Knuth, but the Knowles had watched him through knavish holes that they bore in the trunks of the trees, and the unearthly silence gave way, as it were, with a grace, to the rapid screams of Tonker as they picked him up from behind, screams that came faster and faster until they were incoherent. And where they took him it is not good to ask, and what they did with him I shall not say. Knuth looked on for a while from the corner of the house with a mild surprise on his face as he rubbed his chin, for the trick of the holes in the trees was new to him. Then he stole nimbly away through the dreadful wood. And did they catch Knuth, you ask me, gentle reader? Oh, no, my child, for such a question is childish. Nobody ever catches Knuth. End of how Knuth would have practiced his art upon the Knowles. Recording by Philip Gould.
Coffee Break Collection 16. Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Murder at the Lake. Here's all we've been able to learn, Professor. I wish you'd see what you can make of it, said Sheriff Darrow. Garden's cottage fronts the lake at a point about halfway between the head and foot of its mile length. A strong east wind off the lake that morning caused him and his two guests to abandon their proposed fishing trip. Garden remained behind while Rice and Johnson set off hiking in opposite directions. Rice said that 15 minutes later, as he was retrieving his hat which had blown into the lake, he heard a shot and hurried to the cottage. There he found Johnson with blood on his hands, bending over Garden, who had been shot through the heart. Johnson said he had gone only about 200 yards when he heard the shot and rushed back. He claims he got the blood on his hands when ascertaining if Garden were alive. He also admits moving some furniture, although cautioned against it by Rice. Fortunately for Rice, we found his hat still wet, but discovered he had changed his shirt before the arrival of the police. He had also gone through Garden's desk, but said he removed nothing. Both men entered through the back door, though the front entrance was more convenient. We haven't found a gun or any other weapon, and we haven't been able to establish a motive yet, concluded Darrow. What do you make of it? It's a bit muddled, Sheriff, replied Fordney, but I would question someone further. Of whom was he definitely suspicious, and why? A strong east wind blew off the lake. Therefore, regardless of the direction in which he was walking, Rice's hat could not possibly have blown into the lake. The professor was naturally suspicious of him when he told such a ridiculous lie. Is possible, sits the wind in that corner? Shakespeare. End of Murder at the Lake.
Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Narrative of a London Sneak or Common Thief by John Binney in London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew. Recording by Patrick Wallace. The following narrative was given us by a convicted thief who has for years wandered over the streets of London as a ballad singer and has resided in the low lodging houses scattered over its lowest districts. He was a poor, wretched creature, degraded in condition, of feeble intellect and worthless character, we picked up in a low lodging house in Drury Lane. He was shabbily dressed in a pair of old corduroy trousers, old brown coat, black shabby vest, faded grey neckerchief, an old dark cap and peak, and unwashed shirt. For a few shillings, he was very ready to tell us the sad story of his miserable life. I was born at Abingdon, near Oxford, where my father was a bricklayer and kept the Nelson public house. He died when I was 14 years of age. I was sent to school and was taught to read, but not to write. At this time, I was a steady, well-conducted boy. At 14 years of age, I went to work with my uncle, a basket maker and rag merchant in Abingdon, and lived with my mother. I wrought there for 3 years, making baskets and cutting willows for them. I left my uncle then, as he had not got any more work for me to do, and was living idle with my mother. At this time, I went with a Cheap John to the fairs, and travelled with him the whole of that season. He was a Lancashire man, between 50 and 60 years of age, and had a woman who travelled the country with him, but I do not think they were married. He was a tall, dark-complexioned man and was a duffer, very unprincipled in his dealings. He sold cutlery, books, stationery and hardware. When we were going from one fair to another, we would stop on the road and make a fire and steal fowls and potatoes or any green stuff that was in season. We sometimes travelled along with gypsies, occasionally to the number of 50 or 60 in a gang. The gypsies are a curious sort of people and would not let you connect with any of them unless they saw you were to remain among them. I assisted Cheap John in the markets when selling his goods and handed them to the purchasers. The first thing I ever pilfered was a pair of boots and a handkerchief from a drunken man who lay asleep at a fair in Reading in Berks. He was lying at the back of a booth and no one near him. This was about dusk in September. I pawned the boots at Windsor on the day of a fair for 3 shillings and sold the handkerchief for 1 shilling. I was about 17 years of age when I went with Cheap John and remained with him about 13 weeks when I left on account of a row I had with him. I liked this employment very well, got 2 shillings in the pound for my trouble and sometimes had from £1 to 25 shillings a week. But the fares were only occasional and the money I earned was very precarious. I left Cheap John at Windsor and came to Slough with a horse dealer, where I left him. He gave me 2 shillings for assisting him. I then came up to London, where I have lived ever since in the lodging houses in the different localities. I remember on coming to this great city I was much astonished at its wonders, and every street appeared to me like a fair. On coming to London I had no money, and had not any friend to assist me. I went to Kensington Workhouse and got a night's lodging, and lived for about a fortnight at different workhouses in London. They used to give the lodgers a piece of bread at night and another in the morning, and a night's lodging on straw and boards. I then went out singing ballads in the streets of London and could get at an average from 2 shillings to 2 shillings and 6pence a night. But when the evenings were wet, I could not get anything. In the winter, I sang in the daytime, and in summer I went out in the evening. I have wandered in this way over many of the streets and thoroughfares of London. I sing in Marylebone, Somerstown, Camden Town, Paddington, Whitecross Street, City, Hammersmith, Commercial Road and Whitechapel, and live at different lodgings and make them my own as I move along. I sing different kinds of songs, sentimental and comic. My favourites are Gentle Annie, She's Reckoned a Good Hand at It, The Dandy Husband, The Week's Matrimony, The Old Woman's Sayings, and John Bull and the Taxis. I often sing The Dark-Eyed Sailor and The Female Cabin Boy. For many years now I have lived by singing in the public street, sometimes by myself, at other times with a mate. I occasionally beg in Regent Street and Bond Street on the fly, that is, follow people passing along, and sometimes in Oxford Street and Oban. Sometimes I get a little job to do from people at various kinds of handiwork, such as turning the wheel to polish steel and irons, etc., and do other kinds of job work. When hard up, I pick pockets of handkerchiefs by myself or with one or two mates. In the course of our interview, we saw he was very clumsy at picking pockets. I sometimes go out with the young, dark-complexioned lad you saw downstairs, who is very clever at pocket picking, and has often been convicted before the criminal courts. I have spent many years living in the low lodging houses of London. The worst I ever saw was in Keat Street, Whitechapel, about 9 years ago, before they were reformed and changed. Numbers were then crowded into the different rooms, and the floors were littered with naked people of all ages and of both sexes, men and women and boys and girls, sleeping alongside indiscriminately. It was very common to see young boys and girls sleeping together. The conversations that passed between them and the scenes that were transacted were enough to contaminate the morals of the young. In the morning they used to go to their different haunts over the city, some begging and others thieving. On Sunday evenings the only books read were such as Jack Sheppard, Dick Turpin and the Newgate Calendar they got out of the neighbouring libraries by depositing a shilling. These were read with much interest. The lodgers would sooner have these than any other books. I never saw any of them go to church on Sundays. Sometimes one or two would go to the ragged school, such as the one in Field Lane near Smithfield. It often happened the man left his wife and she came to the lodging house and got a livelihood by begging. Some days she would glean 2 shillings or 3 shillings, and at other times would not get a halfpenny. The thieves were seldom in the lodging house except to meals and at bedtime. They lived on better fare than the beggars. The pickpocket lives better than the sneaking thief, and the pickpocket is thought more of in the lodging houses and prisons than the beggar. The lowest pickpockets often lived in these low lodging houses, some of them young lads and others middle-aged men. The young pickpockets, if clever, soon leave the lodging houses and take a room in some locality, as at Somerstown, Marylebone, the Bird, Whitechapel or Westminster. The pickpockets in lodging houses, for the most part, are stock buzzers, i.e. stealers of handkerchiefs. I've often seen the boys picking each other's pockets for diversion in the lodging houses, many of them from 10 to 11 years of age. There are a great number of sneaks in the lodging houses. 2 of them go out together to the streets, one of them keeps a lookout while the other steals some article, shoes, vest or coat, etc., from the shop or store. I sometimes go out with a mate and take a pair of boots at a shop door and sell them to the pawnbroker or to a labouring man passing in the street. Sometimes I have known the lodgers make up a packet of sawdust and put in a little piece of tobacco to cover an opening, leaving only the tobacco to be seen looking through, and sell it to persons passing by in the street as a packet of tobacco. When I am hard up, I have gone out and stolen a loaf at a baker's shop or chandler's shop and taken it to my lodging. I have often stolen handkerchiefs, silk and cambric from gentlemen's pockets. I once stole a silver snuff box from a man's coat pocket and on one occasion took a pocket book with a lot of papers and postage stamps. I burnt the papers and sold the stamps for about 1 shilling and 6. I never had clothes respectable enough to try purses and watches and did not have nerve for it. I have seen young thieves encouraged by people who kept the lodging houses, such as at Keat Street, Whitechapel, and at the Mint. They would ask the boys if they had anything and wish them to sell it to them, which was generally done at an underprice. In these lodging houses, some lived very well and others were starving. Some had steaks and pickles and plenty of drink, porter and ale, eggs and bacon and cigars to smoke. Some of the poorest go out and get a pennyworth of bread, ha'porth of tea, ha'porth of butter and ha'porth of sugar, and perhaps not have a halfpenny left to pay for their lodging at night. When they do get money, they often go out and spend it in drink, and perhaps the next night are starving again. I have been tried for stealing a quart pot and a handkerchief at Bagnage Wells Police Station, and was taken to Vine Street Police Station for stealing 2 shillings and 6pence from a drunken woman respectably dressed. I took it out of her hand and was seen by a policeman who ran after me and overtook me, but the woman refused to prosecute me and I was discharged. I was also brought before Marylebone Police Court for begging. In my present lodging I am pretty comfortable. We spend our evenings telling tales and conversing to each other on our wanderings and playing at games such as Hunt the Slipper. I have often been in great want and have been driven to steal to get a livelihood. End of Narrative of a London Sneak or Common Thief.
Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Office for Victims of Crime by the U.S. Department of Justice, April 1993. The Office for Victims of Crime, OVC, is one of 5 agencies within the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. Since it was established in 1985, OVC has served as the federal government's focal point for all issues affecting our nation's crime victims. This role translates into a broad offering of programs and activities designed to help crime victims cope with personal and financial devastation resulting from victimization. With the enactment and subsequent amendments to the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, of 1984 as amended, OVC was given responsibility for administrating the Crime Victims Fund, fund, end brackets, the primary financial resource for all federally supported victim programs. This unique funding vehicle is the embodiment of legislative justice in the sense that fund deposits for crime victims consist of fines, special penalty assessments, and forfeited appearance and bail bonds paid by defendants convicted of federal crimes. OVC's programs do not rely on the availability of tax dollars, nor will funding for these programs ever increase the national debt. Rather, federal funding for rape crisis hotlines, shelters for battered women, therapy for abused children, and for direct costs, such as medical expenses not covered by insurance, comes from the pockets of kidnappers, bank robbers, drug dealers, and other predators convicted by U.S. attorneys across the country. Through federal fiscal year 1992, over $900 million has been deposited in the Crime Victims Fund and made available for crime victim services. Grant programs. The office funds a variety of formula and discretionary grant programs throughout the country. Formula Grant Program. Approximately 90 to 95% of the Crime Victims Fund is annually awarded to the states and territories for the Crime Victim Compensation and Assistance Formula grant programs. Each program is funded at about the same dollar amount. OVC's State Compensation and Assistance Division is responsible for awarding the formula grants and ensuring that the funds are expended for their legislated purposes. Crime Victim Compensation Program. State-administered crime victim compensation projects help victims and survivors of homicide victims cope with harsh financial realities left in the wake of crime. Commensurable expenses include medical expenses, costs for mental health counseling, lost wages, and funeral expenses. In some states, costs for eyeglasses, corrective lenses, dental service, and prosthetic devices are also covered. The value of this program far exceeds the dollar and cents award amounts to victimized citizens who have incurred compensable expenses. One survivor of a homicide victim who was awarded state compensation for loss of support and funeral expenses recently described the heart of this formula grant program as follows. To the Crime Victim Compensation Board, I'd like to thank the Oklahoma Crime Victim Compensation Board for anything it might award me. When I received the $500 advance, I cried. The relief was great. The bills are quite frightening to someone who has never been alone. I went from childhood to marriage and motherhood, so I've never had to deal with the perils of life by myself. It's just amazing how much it costs just to exist. Even if I don't receive another penny, I'm glad someone cares about the families of victims, because in reality, we have died too. We just haven't been buried yet. Compensation award amounts to the states are equal to 40% of the amount each state distributes in compensation during the prior fiscal year. Thus, federal dollars are used to reinforce each state's proven commitment to providing compensation to crime victims. As part of the grant award process, OVC applies certain minimum eligibility requirements. For example, the state projects are required to compensate victims of federal crime, as well as victims of drunk driving and domestic violence. The states, however, have great discretion in determining their own application procedures and approval criteria, and in setting their own minimum and maximum award amounts. The Crime Victim Compensation Program is an excellent example of a state and federal partnership that works. All states and territories, with the exception of one, participate in this program. Crime Victim Assistance Program. The Victim Assistance Program addresses a wide variety of victim needs. The program makes it possible for victims to attend court hearings by funding the provision for babysitting and transportation services. The program provides victims of domestic violence with shelter when, due to safety concerns, they are forced to leave their homes. It provides abused children with professional therapy. The assistance program furnishes lifeline services to victims at a time in their lives when their sense of reality, security, and physical well-being is abruptly shattered. Of those grants awarded for assistance in 1991, over 12% funded services for child abuse victims. Over 21% funded services for domestic violence victims. Nearly 14% funded services for sexual assault victims. And over 10% supported the provision of services to underserved victims of violent crimes, such as survivors of homicide victims, victims of drunk driving crashes, etc. These areas of funding concentration are consistent with VOCA mandated funding priorities for OVC. Currently, 1/3 of approximately 7,000 providers of victim assistance throughout the country receive VOCA funding. They are located in churches, hospitals, law enforcement agencies, mental health associations, social services agencies, and prosecutors' offices. The VOCA funding awarded to the state grantees is distributed at the state level through subgrants to direct service providers. While the states must comply with certain minimum funding requirements, they retain great control over the selection of applicants for funding. Each state and territory receives a formula award base amount of $200,000 plus additional distributions based on population size and the total amount available for the assistance program in the Crime Victims Fund. Discretionary grant programs. The purpose of the discretionary grant program is to improve the quality and enhance the availability of victim services. As a discretionary grant funding priority, OVC reaches out to isolated, underserved victim populations in dire need of assistance. Such grants have initiated victim assistance programs on remote Indian reservations and have made services available to sexually exploited children. Discretionary grants also provide training and thereby improve the quality of services rendered by providers of victim assistance. OVC training and technical assistance programs explore emerging issues in the field. They also initiate and expand victim services within criminal justice system components. The discretionary grant programs are administered within OVC by two office divisions, the Federal Crime Victims Division and the Special Projects Division. The Federal Crime Victims Division trains federal criminal justice system personnel and develops programs to handle victims whose cases are handled within the federal criminal justice system. Specific projects administered by this division include Emergency Service Fund, a special fund created to address the need of victims of federal crimes when local resources are unavailable. Victim witness coordinators from the 93 U.S. Attorney's offices access the fund in emergency situations involving victims and witnesses. Services financed through this fund include travel to facilitate participation at trial, emergency shelter, and counseling services. Assistance for Federal Victims of Crime in Indian County Grant Program. A program to establish a permanent network of culturally responsive crime victim assistance programs in Native American communities that are located on federal land areas. Children's Justice Act Discretionary Grant Program for Native Americans. A program designed to improve the investigation and prosecution of child abuse in Indian country so as to limit additional trauma to victims. Training and technical assistance for federal officials. A continuous effort to train federal prosecutors, law enforcement officers, witness victim coordinators, and corrections officials on formulating effective responses to the rights and needs of crime victims. The Special Projects Division, like the Federal Crime Victims Division, designs discretionary grant programs to facilitate a comprehensive, high-quality provision of victim assistance throughout the country. Specifically, this division has administered programs to provide victim assistance to sexually exploited children transported across state lines for illicit purposes, support the investigation and prosecution of child abuse throughout the country, advance victim awareness of civil legal remedies against perpetrators, provide services to address the needs of specific populations, such as Hispanic victims and victims of bias crimes, and enhance the provision of victim services by specific types of social service professionals, such as mental health professionals and the clergy. The Special Projects Division demonstrates its ongoing commitment to implement the recommendations set forth in the President's Task Force on Victims of Crime 1982 final report by working to institutionalize an awareness of victim rights among criminal justice system professionals. OVC-sponsored training and technical assistance projects are now available to law enforcement officers, judges, probation and parole officers, and prosecutors throughout the country. These projects serve to introduce crime victims to criminal justice system professionals as parties of interest who have legitimate concerns deserving of due attention and an effective response. Non-grant related leadership efforts. The office undertakes numerous activities designed to focus public attention on crime victim needs and to advance crime victim rights. Staff members routinely participate in regional public speaking engagements and skills workshops on victim issues. In addition, OVC annually hosts an event during National Crime Victims' Rights Week to honor the accomplishments of outstanding victim advocates. In recent years, selected award recipients have been honored by the President, Attorney General, and Director of OVC at White House Rose Garden ceremonies. With respect to federal legislation, OVC plays a key role in monitoring and facilitating federal agency compliance with statutory mandates affecting victims. The Victim Witness Protection Act of 1982 was the first piece of federal legislation to articulate certain services and minimum rights that should be afforded to crime victims. The 1990 Crime Control Act subsequently outlined the federal government's responsibility for addressing the statutory rights of victims participating in the federal criminal justice system. Specifically, Title V, the Victims' Rights and Restitution Act of 1990 is a Bill of Rights that directs each U.S. agency engaged in the detection, investigation, or prosecution of crime to identify victims of crime and provide specified services. Title II, the Victims of Child Abuse Act of 1990, enables the federal criminal justice system to adapt judicial procedures to address the unique needs and abilities of child victims and witnesses. Through its Federal Crime Victims Division, OVC monitors federal agency compliance with such statutes and reports to both the Attorney General and Congress regarding the status of victim and witness treatment within the federal criminal justice system. OVC is also responsible for coordinating Department of Justice training programs to implement the statutory mandates. Conclusion: OVC plays a pivotal leadership role in the victims movement. The office supplements, reinforces, and encourages an expansion of state compensation and assistance programs throughout the country. VOCA funding is used by the Office for Victims of Crime to reach out to isolated, often neglected populations of victims, such as sexually exploited children and victims residing on remote Indian reservations. The office also awards grants to sponsor high-quality training and technical assistance on cutting-edge substantive issues of interest to victim advocates, as well as to criminal justice system personnel who regularly interface with victims. These efforts are funded through OVC's formula and discretionary grant program. OVC's leadership role at the federal level also encompasses activities designed to draw public attention to crime victim needs and to promote victim rights through legislation and public policy. In short, the Office for Victims of Crime embraces a multi-dimensional role at the federal level as an advocate for crime victims. For additional information, please contact Office for Victims of Crime, 633 Indiana Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20531, 202-514-6444. End of Office for Victims of Crime by the U.S. Department of Justice, April 1993.
Coffee Break Collection 16. This is a LibriVox recording All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. On the Scent by Harold Austin Ripley. I couldn't wait to be announced, said George Collins, Florida's foremost prohibition agent, and a great wit, as he stepped into the professor's office. How long are you going to be in New York? Asked Fordman, as the two friends shook hands. I'm due back in Miami now, replied Collins, but I wanted to congratulate you on your success in the Hicks murder case. I wish interesting things like that would happen in my game. However, I did have an amusing experience last December. Sneaky Joe, a stool pigeon, tipped me off to a huge still he said was working about 40 miles from headquarters. A narrow road through dense woods led to the spot. Arriving there, I found an old, dilapidated shanty screened by trees. As I entered the woods, I smelled alcohol. Sneaky Joe was right, after all, I thought, as I drove up to the shanty. I got out and peered cautiously around, but the place seemed deserted. After opening the door and entering the house, however, I knew liquor was not being made there. I searched the woods, but found nothing. As I was driving back along the road at a good rate, I discovered the alcohol I smelled was coming from my own radiator. Imagine my chagrin. The professor laughed heartily and said to his friend, "Stay over for my birthday party tonight. The ladies would love to hear that yarn of yours." What did the professor find preposterous in Collins' story? Answer: on the scent. Not even a prohibition agent would use alcohol in an automobile radiator in or about Miami. The oil and wine of merry meeting. Irving. End of On the Scent by Harold Austin Ripley.
Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Perfect Crime by H.A. Ripley. Peter Johannes had one burning ambition: to commit a perfect crime. After much thinking and careful planning, he chose burglary for his experiment and a large brownstone mansion for the scene of his action. Learning his occupants had left town, he arrayed himself in a business suit of conservative cut, flung a light topcoat over his arm, picked up a Gladstone bag, covered with foreign labels, and set out. He had ascertained, of course, when the policeman patrolling that beat was farthest away. At such a time, he drove up in his swanky sport roadster, swung jauntily to the sidewalk, skipped up the steps, and fitted a skeleton key into the lock, which yielded easily. So far, so good, he thought. Inside, he adjusted a black mask to his eyes and silk gloves to his hands. The former for a bit of local colour he couldn't resist, the latter for more practical purposes. What a jolly thing this burglaring was! He quickly filled his Gladstone with silver and other valuables. Hurrying out, he removed his gloves after closing the door. Done, and not a single clue left, he said to himself. As he was about to descend the steps, he saw out of the corner of his eye the policeman rounding the corner. Feigning disinterest, he quickly pushed the bell button and stood there, whistling. "Hey, you!" shouted the policeman, now standing at the bottom of the steps. "What are you doing there? Them people ain't home." "Howdy, officer, how goes it?" said our hero blithely, as he turned to greet the blue coat. "I know they're not home. Been trying to raise someone for 5 minutes. Annoying, too, after running out to see them. Oh, well," he continued, "I'll be going along," as he unconcernedly picked up his bag. "You bet you will. Right to the Who's-Go," bellowed the guardian of the peace. "Your story I might have believed, but come on now, I'm taking you down." Alas for the perfect crime. What caused our hero's arrest? Asked Professor Fordney of his class. Alas, Peter Johannes had forgotten to remove his mask on leaving the house. Whoever thinks a perfect work to see, thinks what ne'er was, nor is, nor e'er shall be. Pope. End of The Perfect Crime by H.A. Ripley.